All right, so in this vignette, we're going to talk about Molly Weasley, who recently started a job, an hourly wage job as a herbologist at a large herbology firm. And then she spends her income between butterbeer and roast beef sandwiches. In the question, we're saying these are both normal goods, which means that the quantity demanded goes up when her income goes up. And then we're asked just for, exposition reasons to show butterbeer on the horizontal axis and roast beef sandwiches on the vertical axis. Okay, so nice. So we have our basic setup, and we have 3 questions. So the first question, we're asked to use 2 graphs to show what would happen to Molly's choice of butterbeer if the number of shops selling it were to increase. All right, so to do this, we're going to draw 2 graphs, and like we're asked to, we're going to have butterbeer on the horizontal axis and roast beef sandwiches on the vertical axis. So for the first graph, let's set this up. And then for the butterbeer, the budget constraint, the butterbeer constraint, we have butterbeer on the horizontal axis, and we have roast beef sandwiches on the vertical axis. So we'll use B and R. And then let's just label this graph Molly's problem. Molly's problem. And then we also were told something about the number of shops selling butterbeer. So we also need some idea of what's happening to the market for butterbeer. So let's look over here. This is the butterbeer market. And then, so the horizontal axis will have the quantity of butterbeer, which we'll just call B, and then the price on the vertical axis. And if you wanted to call this, Q, you could label it that way too. All right, so first let's set up the solution to Molly's problem. And let's do this in red. So originally, we have her budget constraint. So we'll call this budget constraint 1. And then we also have her consumer's problem, her indifference curve. So we'll plot this. Let's call this indifference curve 1. Okay, so we have indifference curve 1. We've found the indifference curve that's tangent to her budget constraint. And this gives us the solution to Molly's consumer's problem. So this point of tangency tells us the quantity of butterbeer she'll buy, and it tells us the quantity of roast beef that she'll buy. Remember, this is the idea with this solution, is that we can never end up on a higher indifference curve while still having that point be attainable. All right, so this is the solution. And in this question, we're asked about changes in the number of firms in the butterbeer market. So to set this up, we're going to have a supply curve for the butterbeer market. And this will look, very familiar to a lot of things we've worked with this semester, particularly in part B. But so we have our demand curve and our supply curve, and we have an intersection of supply and demand, which tells us, our equilibrium quantity. So this is our Q star of butterbeer. But importantly for this question, we have an equilibrium price for the quantity of butterbeer, for the market of butterbeer. So we have equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. What the question tells us is that the number of shops selling butterbeer increased. So we know from part B, in our discussion of shifters, that as the number of firms increases, as the number of sellers increases, the supply curve is going to shift out. So the supply curve, after this increase in the number of butterbeer sellers, will shift out. I've drawn this maybe with a slightly different slope, but essentially we're just increasing the number of sellers. All right, so we have our new equilibrium quantity, so we'll call this maybe Q prime, and our new equilibrium price, our P prime. So we can see as the number of butterbeer sellers go up, the price of butterbeer is going to go down. So we can represent that on our consumers problem graph. So the price of butterbeer went down, which means for Molly, just intuitively, she can now afford more butterbeer. And what that would mean is if she was buying only butterbeer, she could buy more of that. But if she was only buying, if she was buying no butterbeer, the price of butterbeer changing wouldn't impact what's affordable to her. So we get what we call a pivot in the budget constraint. So we get this pivot out in the budget constraint. So we'll call this budget constraint 2. All right. So now we can see the old point is still affordable. It's just no longer directly on her budget constraint. She can afford more because of this pivot out in the budget constraint. So what that means is she can actually achieve a higher level of indifference. So let's draw a new indifference curve that's now tangent to her new budget constraint. So we'll call this indifference curve 2. Okay, so she has her point of tangency between the budget constraint and the indifference curve, which tells us, again, after this shift in the budget constraint and this higher level of indifference, that this is the highest level of indifference she can achieve, which is given to us by this point of tangency. Okay, so nice. So this is the new solution to Molly's consumers problem. So this is R2 and B2. So we've seen a shift in the market for butterbeer changes what Molly is going to do. She's changing her behavior in response to the market. So we get a shift out in butterbeer and a shift out in roast beef sandwiches. All right, so very nice. Have we answered this question? Use 2 graphs to show what would happen to Molly's choice of butterbeer if the number of shops were selling it were to increase. And here we're showing that it will increase. So B increases from B1 to B2. Nice. Perfect. Okay, so let's move on to the second question. Using 2 graphs, one of the labor market and one of the consumer's problem, show what would happen to Molly's choice of butterbeer after the discovery that a standard herbology technique could cure previously untreatable magical maladies, raising the demand for herbologists. So the important piece of information here is that the demand for herbologists has gone up. And so what we're going to do is set up a labor market graph for herbologists and a final goods, we're going to set up Molly's problem on the other side. So we have 2 graphs, and we're going to plot both of these. So for the first one, we have the labor market. So this is, we'll just call this herbologists. So on the horizontal axis, we will have labor, so the quantity of labor that's exchanged in the market. And then on the vertical axis, we'll have wages. So we have labor and wages, which sets up our labor market. Then for the second graph, we also have, it's essentially the same graph as we did in question 1. We have butterbeer on the horizontal, and we have roast beef sandwiches on the vertical. Now, our initial setup, we have a supply curve of labor. So this is our supply curve of labor. So remember, these are coming from the supply curve is coming from workers. And then we have a demand curve for labor. So that's the demand curve for labor. And behind the scenes, we talked about this is the value of the marginal product of labor. The value of the marginal product of labor. Okay, so the equilibrium in this market is told to us by the intersection of the supply curve and the demand curve for labor. So this is this thing. So we have our L, let's call this L1. It's the equilibrium labor in the herbologist labor market. So this is, how much labor is being provided and demanded by workers and employers. And then we also have W1. So this is, the wages that clear the market. All right, so next we're going to set up the solution to Molly's problem. So the first thing is to set up the budget constraint initially. So this isn't that complicated to start off with, right? All we do is we draw our budget constraint, just like we did before in the first question, and we draw our indifference curve. So indifference curve 1. Okay, and then this gives us the solution, the point of tangency between these two things. Remember, we're always trying to find the point on the budget constraint that gives us the highest indifference curve, moving further out, climbing the mountain in that third dimension off the page. So here we have B1 and we have R1. So this question is asking what happens to Molly's problem when we increase the demand for herbologists. So what we're going to do is shift the demand curve for herbologists, and this is in green. We're showing that the demand curve has increased. So we get a shift out in the demand curve for herbologists, so our D prime. So this has, market equilibrium impacts. So we have this new equilibrium point. So we have our L2. So what happens is we get this shift out in the demand curve for herbologists. So everyone who was working in the market for herbology is now in higher demand. So this raises the quantity that's the quantity of labor employed in the market, and it raises wages. So wages now have gone up. So the number of hours and people employed has gone up at the same time that wages have. So this is really nice for herbologists. So at the same time, we know because wages are going up for Molly, her income is going to go up as well. So we have this increase in her budget. We get a shift out in her budget constraint. So we're going to see this shift out. And I'm not going to draw the intercepts because that would get a little messy. So we're just going to draw, the budget constraint generally shifting out. And because she now can afford more, both of the roast beef sandwiches and of the butterbeer, she can now achieve a higher level of indifference. And this higher level of indifference can be found at the point of tangency between her new budget constraint and some indifference curve, whatever that highest indifference curve may be. So that looks like this. So we have an increase in the quantity demanded of butterbeer by Molly, and we have an increase in the quantity demanded of roast beef sandwiches by Molly. And so what's this question asking us for? It's asking us, show what would happen to Molly's choice of butterbeer after the discovery that a standard herbology technique, raising the demand for herbologists. So this is, again, B increases from B1 to B2. Nice. So we have a third question. And this third question asks us, use two graphs, one of the labor market and one of the consumer's problem, to show what would happen to Molly's choice of butterbeer following the release of a blockbuster wizarding film that glamorized the adventures and mysterious aspects of herbology. So the main result here is that there's a dramatic rise in the popularity of the profession among young witches and wizards. So more people wish to enter this profession. Okay. So we have two graphs. We have the market for herbologists with labor on the horizontal and wages on the vertical. And then we have Molly's problem. With butterbeer on the horizontal and roast beef sandwiches on the vertical. All right, so first let's set up the initial equilibrium in the labor market. So we have our supply curve for herbologists, and we have the demand curve for herbologists, which gives us the equilibrium quantity of employment, L1, and the equilibrium wage, W1. Okay, and then let's set up Molly's problem. So we'll set up our budget constraint 1, and we'll draw in the indifference curve that makes us as well off as possible, which happens, again, when the indifference curve is tangent to the budget constraint. So it tells us the quantity. For consistency, let's do this in red. Okay, so we have B1 and R1. And then the question is telling us that the popularity of the profession is increasing among young witches and wizards. So we're actually going to see a shift in the supply curve of the labor market. So as more people enter this labor market, we actually see a shift out in the supply curve of the labor market. And so what this does is it increases the equilibrium employment. So more people are employed in the herbology profession. But because we haven't seen a change in the demand curve, what we're going to see is a decrease in the wage level. So different from this one, where we saw a shift in the demand curve, increasing both wages and employment, here, because we're seeing a shift in the supply curve, we see an increase in employment, but we see a decrease in wages. And so what happens for Molly is actually the opposite of question 2. So we see a shift in her budget constraint. She's now making less than she was before, under the assumption that her wages are coming directly from the labor market. So her budget constraint shifts in, which then means she can afford less, which puts her on a lower indifference curve. And what this means for her, the solution to her problem, is that she's now buying less than she was before. So we see a decrease in the quantity demanded of butterbeer from Molly, and a decrease in the quantity demanded of roast beef sandwiches from Molly. So the conclusion here is that B decreases from B1 to B2. Okay, and then let's just make sure we've answered the question directly. What happens to Molly's choice of butterbeer following the release of this blockbuster wizarding film? Okay, so this is, these are the types of questions we can answer when we've connected the final goods market, or the final goods market, to Molly's problem. And we've connected the labor market also to Molly's problem. Okay, I'll see you in the next one.